Picture this: the morning sun rising over the Nile. A soft gold light spills across the river, glimmering against the backs of crocodiles drifting lazily through the reeds. The great temples of Thebes and Luxor stand like giants from another age, their colossal columns painted in bright blues and reds that time has since stolen away. The priests are already awake, shaven heads glistening with oil, linen robes freshly laundered, feet bare against the cool stone floors. The smell of incense fills the air, frankincense, myrrh, and lotus, rising in slow curls toward the painted ceilings where gods watch from the walls. Outside, farmers are beginning their day, steering oxen through the wet mud, calling out prayers to ensure a good harvest. But inside the temples, something entirely different is happening, something most ordinary Egyptians would never see, and never dare question, because within those walls, in the holiest of places, the priests claim to serve the gods, but what they do to the women chosen to serve alongside them was something darker, something far beyond divine devotion. For most of us today, the image of ancient Egypt is one of majesty, golden sarcophagi, towering pyramids, and immortal pharaohs. But Egypt's real power didn't come from the tombs of kings, it came from the temples. These weren't just places of worship, they were the banks, the schools, and the governments of their time, sprawling institutions that controlled everything from agriculture to taxation. The priests who ran them were some of the richest and most influential men in Egypt, and while the pharaoh wore the crown, it was often the priests who truly ruled. Their job was to keep the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe from descending into chaos. Every sunrise, every flood of the Nile, every breath of wind was, in their minds, tied to ritual. Without their ceremonies, the world itself might collapse, and among these rituals were the temple women, the so-called pure servants of the gods. They were known by different titles depending on the temple and the era: divine adoratresses, chantresses, God's wives. The last one, God's wife of Amun, was the most powerful of all. On the surface, it sounded like the ultimate honor. To be chosen as the wife of a god meant prestige, wealth, even reverence. But the truth behind the temple doors was not divine. It was human, all too human. When a girl was selected for service, her family often rejoiced. It was a guarantee of social elevation. The temple would clothe her, feed her, educate her. She would live among the gods themselves. But once she passed through those gates, her freedom ended. The temple was a fortress, immense walls, guarded gates, and endless corridors leading deeper and deeper into the sacred chambers. The air inside was cool and dark, the silence broken only by the sound of distant chanting and the soft splash of water in ceremonial pools. Everything inside was ritual. Every gesture had meaning. The women bathed in cold water several times a day to cleanse themselves of sin and impurity. Their hair was shaved off completely, their bodies rubbed with oils until they gleamed in the torchlight. They wore thin linen robes, white as bone, symbolizing the purity of their souls. But all of that purity came at a cost, because once inside they could never leave. Their duty was to serve the god, and through him the priests who claimed to be his voice on earth. The young women were taught music, dance, and sacred incantations. They learned how to sing hymns, play the sistrum, a kind of sacred rattle, and move in slow, graceful patterns meant to please the god. The public saw them as holy figures, untouchable and blessed. But behind the carved doors of the inner sanctum, where no outsider ever entered, the line between holy and horrifying began to blur. The Egyptians believed the gods could enter the physical world through human vessels. The priests claimed that during certain rituals, especially those celebrating fertility or renewal, the gods themselves demanded a union. The ritual was called the divine conception or sacred marriage, and the chosen vessel for this union? A temple virgin. Imagine being 15 years old, your head freshly shaved, your life dedicated to a god you cannot see. You're told that tonight, that God will come to you. You'll be dressed in shimmering linen, bathed in oils, anointed with sacred perfumes. Incense fills the air, thick and heady. The priests chant in the ancient language of the gods. The room grows hot. The smoke curls in the torchlight. And then, a man steps forward, not a god, a priest. He tells you he carries the god's essence, that through him you will become divine. The ritual begins. The god is said to enter his body, and the sacred act that follows is framed as spiritual union. But what it really was violation justified by religion. The priests called it divine duty. The women were told it was an honor. But to the gods? Silence. Now, not every temple in Egypt functioned like this. Egypt was vast, its traditions constantly shifting over thousands of years. Some temple women genuinely lived as respected spiritual figures, but the higher you climbed, in rank, the more the line blurred between holy and political power. The god's wife of Amun, for example, became one of the most politically powerful titles in Egypt's later dynasties. These women were often daughters of pharaohs, given to the temple to strengthen royal influence. They had servants, estates, and enormous wealth. But even they lived under permanent vows of chastity and obedience. They could never marry, never have children, never leave. The temple wasn't a sanctuary, it was a gilded cage. Some of these women used their influence strategically. Figures like Amenedas I, Shepenupet II, and Nitocris wielded real political control. They administered temple finances, organized religious festivals, and commanded thousands of servants. Yet even they were prisoners of ritual, every act of their lives scripted by male priests who spoke in the name of gods. Outside the temple walls, Egyptians saw these women as near divine. They would bow, offer gifts, whisper prayers in their name, but none of them knew the loneliness, the silence, and the fear that ruled those inner chambers. And if a temple woman ever rebelled, or tried to escape, the consequences were horrifying. Egyptian records describe punishments for impure acts within sacred precincts. The guilty were stripped of their titles, their names carved out of inscriptions, their images destroyed, a punishment worse than death. To be erased from the walls meant to lose your soul in the afterlife. You would wander for eternity, nameless, forgotten. The priests didn't need prisons, they had fear. And yet the paradox is striking. Because Egyptian religion was obsessed with purity, balance, and cosmic order, the priests believed they were preserving Ma'at, the harmony between gods and men. They thought their rituals kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding. Every drop of water poured, every offering burned, was a matter of life and death for the world. But in their pursuit of divine perfection, they built a system that devoured human lives, especially those of young women. Some ancient inscriptions praise these temple virgins as pure of body, beloved of the god. It sounds poetic until you realize that purity in this world meant silence, obedience, isolation. Their daily lives were relentless. They rose before dawn to bathe, reciting hymns as cold water poured over their skin. They prepared offerings of bread, beer, and honey. They chanted through hours of ritual, breathing incense until their heads swam, and when night fell, they slept in quarters guarded by priests, never free to step outside, never again to see their families. To the priests, this was devotion. To us, it sounds like imprisonment. But here's the most chilling part. Many of these women likely believed in it. They truly thought their suffering kept the universe alive, that by surrendering everything, their bodies, their voices, their freedom, they were serving something eternal. It's hard to imagine what went through their minds. Did they find comfort in faith? Or did they realize too late that the gods they served never spoke back? Egypt's own texts never condemned the system. Why would they? The priests wrote the history. They recorded what they wanted remembered, not what they wanted hidden. And the truth is, this wasn't unique to Egypt. The idea of sacred virgins, women set apart for divine service, appears everywhere. The Greeks had the Oracle of Delphi, where young women inhaled intoxicating fumes and delivered prophecies to trembling men. The Romans had the Vestal Virgins, sworn to celibacy for 30 years, under threat of being buried alive if they broke their vows. Across cultures, the pattern repeats: purity, obedience, and total control. Religion cloaked it all in sanctity. But strip away the hymns and incense, and what remains is human power. Men controlling women through fear and faith. By the end of Egypt's new kingdom, the temples had become political fortresses. Pharaohs came and went, but the priesthood remained. They controlled land, gold, slaves, and most importantly, belief. The more people feared divine punishment, the stronger the priests became. Eventually, foreign empires noticed, when the Persians, and later the Greeks and Romans, conquered Egypt. They looked at the temple system and saw something dangerous. A rival power structure built on superstition, They dismantled it piece by piece. The rituals faded, the hieroglyphs were forgotten, and the gods fell silent. The last true temple rituals ended around 400 CE, long after Egypt's pharaohs were dust. And the women who once served inside, their names, their faces, their stories, vanished into the sands. But sometimes the past whispers. In the ruins of Thebes, archaeologists have found tombs belonging to women who once held those sacred titles. Their coffins are inscribed with blessings from Amun and Ra. They're depicted holding sistrums and lotus flowers, smiling serenely, surrounded by symbols of divine purity. To the casual eye, it looks like a happy ending, a holy woman honored in death. But look closer, and you might notice something else. The same words repeated again and again, pure, obedient, silent. You realize those words weren't blessings, they were rules. So when you walk through the remains of Karnak or Luxor today, with their vast pillars and echoing courtyards, try to imagine the sounds that once filled them. The soft footsteps of women moving in ritual, the rhythmic clatter of bronze instruments, the low chanting of priests, and somewhere in the shadows, a young girl kneeling, whispering prayers she's been taught since childhood. To her it's sacred. To us, it's tragic. She doesn't know that history will forget her name, that the God she serves will one day be a myth, that her sacrifice will vanish like sand in the wind. She only knows what she's been told, that her body is not her own, that pain is purity, and that somewhere above the clouds, a God is watching. Maybe that's what's most haunting about ancient Egypt, not the mummies or the curses, but how much faith people had in their own suffering. They built their civilization on devotion, and it gave them beauty that's lasted for millennia. But beneath that beauty, there's a silence that never quite fades, the silence of those who were never allowed to speak. So the next time you see the temples of Egypt, standing proud against the desert horizon, remember what they're built on. They weren't just monuments to gods, they were monuments to control, to what people will do and endure when they believe it's divine, because history isn't only about kings and pyramids, it's also about the forgotten, the ones whose stories were buried under incense and stone. The temple virgins were called holy, but in truth they were prisoners of belief. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all, that the cruelest things humans have ever done weren't in the name of hatred, but in the name of faith.